Hi there, and welcome to Mom and Mind. I'm your host, Dr. Kat. On this episode, I am so excited to bring you this interview with Rachel Louise Moran. She is an associate professor of history at the University of North Texas, and she is talking with us today about her book, Blue, A History of Postpartum Depression in America. And let me tell you, I love this conversation, and I'm reminded how important it is for us to have any kind of history and historical knowledge, but in particular in perinatal mental health, having this view on the history of postpartum depression in America is informative and important for our work to move forward. Rachel teaches US women's and gender history and the history of medicine. And her book, Blue, A History of Postpartum Depression in America, which is a history of postpartum distress and mental illness in the United States from 1945 to the present, with a focus on the activism of both new mothers and clinicians. She shares with us a bit of her story, what led her to write the book, why understanding this history is important, and how it can be useful for us now moving forward. I'm real excited for you to hear this interview. So let's dive in and meet Rachel. Welcome, Rachel. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me today.
I'm super excited to talk about your book, and I know people who are listening will love to hear this kind of longer perspective on the history of postpartum depression in the U.S. It's a really fascinating topic, and I'm sure, as you'll tell us, just the how mental health has been talked about and addressed throughout history has changed quite a bit. So I'm excited to hear what you have found out in your work. So yeah, thank you so much for doing the work and for coming on to share about it. What led you to write this book, Blue?
So, I'm a historian of politics and gender and health, as well as medical questions. And I had written my first book, and then I was pregnant. And at the same time I was pregnant, I was trying to think of what I would write another book on.
Mm-hmm.
And had during this process, I was looking at different things about pregnancy and nutrition, different kind of questions. But while I was doing some of that research, I was also navigating my own experience. And so I went to the my psychiatrist while I was pregnant, and I had a history um, of an eating disorder, of some moderate mental health problems, nothing. But in any case, I had read so many sort of natural health books, and I was really prepared to be essentially a perfect pregnant person.
Ah.
And so I'm sure this is a very familiar narrative. I know it
Uh-huh.
is in my
Yeah.
work.
Yeah.
So I went to the psychiatrist who was this very very old white man, basically like a if you had central casting for a psychiatrist, it would be him. And I said basically I need to be off the meds. I am there's things unknown. I just can't. And he was extremely hesitant. And I was surprised because again, I was pretty stable in the day to day as much as anybody can be in pregnancy.
Mhm.
But he basically started asking me these questions, which I write about in the book, that were not the kind of questions I expected. So instead of asking me medical questions or questions about like my mood or my depression levels, he was asking me, what does your parental leave look like? And are you going to be able to take FMLA? And what, where does your family live? Is anybody going to be there? And I thought these were really frustrating questions because they weren't the sort of medical answer I sought.
Yeah.
And I was also just frustrated because as a historian, this idea that a male medical professional would say
Mhm.
like, no, you can't make these choices for your body
Right,
was
right.
very jarring.
Mhm.
Um, but what ended up, as the conversation went on, it just became clear that he was concerned um, about many of the social factors around pregnancy and the postpartum,
Mhm.
and about some of this sort of bigger picture of what this all looked like. And as I started then asking questions about what does it mean to say that I'm at risk
Mhm.
of postpartum mental
Mm-hmm.
illness? What does it mean to say that there should be intervention here?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I found first was just that I had been so wildly ignorant and naive going into that conversation because the number of women I've talked to who went through this in the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s,
Mm-hmm.
and would have just killed for a provider to be asking them all
Right,
of
right, right.
these social questions, to be intervening, was actually extraordinary. I had
Mm-hmm.
no sense of my privilege at that time. And I then had no sense of the history that got us there.
Mm-hmm.
It was not inevitable that this psychiatrist would be asking these questions.
Right,
And it is still certainly not the case today.
right.
People lucky enough to have that kind of mental health care even are
Yeah,
then going to be asked those questions.
absolutely.
Yeah, so the
Yeah.
book came from trying to trace how that got there.
Wow. That's one of the things I love about, talking to people who have the combination of what you went through plus your profession is that you are able to have perspectives on things that, us who, let's say, are not history professors are not going to immediately go to. And it just sheds such new light and new perspective onto things like postpartum depression and mental health, because your lived experience plus your professional knowledge and wisdom and experience come together in a way that, like, I wouldn't be able to do. So I just really appreciate that it came up as a possibility for you, as something to explore.
Yeah, and as I did it, of course, also, as you know very well, there's this huge diversity of
Mhm.
perinatal mental health distress and
Yeah.
illness. And so I brought my own experience into it, and it's there in the book. But I also was very careful that, I spoke to women who experienced psychosis, who experienced OCD, who just had very different experiences than me as well.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. So, where did you start? How did you start looking into this question?
Yeah. So I began essentially as a medical historian, and I don't want to get too in the weeds for um, of historianness, but basically I was reading old medical journals and what were they saying in the 19th century? What were psychiatrists or alienists saying, and what were they saying in the 1920s and so on? And there's really interesting stories in that about diagnosis,
Mm.
but it felt very not human to me after a while.
Oh.
So there just weren't enough people, and the people who
Mm.
were there were primarily just coming to me through the lens of what a male psychiatrist said about them,
Sure.
right? Because their story wasn't on the record. It was just the case
Uh,
study.
oh, sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
So especially as I got then toward the more modern period, I just ended up saying, all right, I'm gonna have to do oral history.
Mm.
I get a little nervous about talking to people, though I overcame that in the process. But I was like, all right, and I'm
Mhm.
intimidated by some of the amazing people that I interviewed. But I had a grant to collect interviews, which are collected at our archives here at the
Nice.
University of North Texas. And I wanted to learn from the folks who had been professionals, been advocates,
Hmm.
um, worked in front of Congress, worked in grassroots organizations, who had done all of these different things.
Hmm.
And then it just kind of completely changed everything, right? It was extremely human then. It was extremely
Hmm.
about the women. And it wasn't a story about what doctors did, although they're all over the place, obviously.
Sure.
But it was a story about what doctors and and women doctors and, psychologists and therapists and all of these folks did together,
Hmm.
and how that changed things.
I'm curious, what are the kinds of things that struck you about what you found or what you heard?
So I think I've been really interested. one of the core themes that comes out, and one of the questions that drove me was really a question of how to make sense of advocacy around postpartum depression,
Mm,
which has led over the years to the visibility of postpartum depression, has led to screening procedures and statements, has led to psychopharmaceutical options, led to so many different things, right?
mhm,
Insurance changes,
mhm,
but how that advocacy happened and also how it happened differently than some of the other women's health narratives historians write about around
mm,
abortion,
mm,
around contraceptives, right? These women's health histories are all happening sometimes in the same years,
mm,
but they have somewhat different trajectories. And so I was curious about how this sort of activism worked differently in different spaces. So, I had interviewed like one woman who wrote for Our Bodies Ourselves, which was the sort of DIY medical women's medical work of the late 1960s and very early 70s, and had this extreme social construction view of everything.
mm.
She had been hospitalized for her postpartum illness, but to her, the issue was almost entirely childcare and isolation.
Oh,
And when I look at folks who were doing this advocacy work in the 80s, there was some concern about social support. And it's also balanced then with much more concern about hormonal causes
mm,
and about other medical causes or
mhm,
biomedical causes. And so I was really interested in how that plays out in terms of what kind of solutions folks seek.
mm,
There's a longer history in some of those other women's health movements, for instance,
mhm.
of refusing to collaborate with doctors and in the 60s and 70s. And
In
that's
which
not the
which
story.
movement?
Oh, the women's health movement. So around
Like,
abortion,
oh,
especially.
abortion especially. Okay, right,
Yeah.
right.
Or just like being unable to find doctors that were allies.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And in terms of postpartum folks, I mean, there's a number of male allies who are critical by the late 70s, but certainly in the 80s and
Hmm.
90s.
Hmm.
And psychiatrists who I write about, like Dr. Jim Hamilton, Dr. Rick Fernandez, they just end up being these like critical figures in these women's grassroots groups.
Hmm.
So there was really no sense that these were separate conversations. Yeah.
Interesting. Right. And I imagine because there is, I mean, from sitting from where I'm sitting in my lens now, this biological, psychological, social, medical, like these factors that impact um, things like perinatal mental health, postpartum depression, that the ways that it can be approached are varied then as well in ways that I don't know. Not saying that in any way that abortion advocacy is straightforward, not at all. Um, but the complexity of what's happening for somebody and why they're experiencing something like postpartum depression is just different,
Mhm.
and potentially different anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it just raises some different questions, and it also has different kinds of politics about motherhood. And the 1980s, when a lot of this activism really is starting. So, Postpartum Support International is formally founded in 1987, and Depression After Delivery, which was its peer organization for decades,
Mm-hmm.
was founded in 1985. And so the 80s become really important. The Marseille Society
Mm-hmm.
is founded in 1980, though that was more aimed at professionals originally. Or
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so it's just this real moment of momentum. But I also see that moment of momentum happening at a time when, in especially the US and UK context, there's a lot of conservative discourse about motherhood and what motherhood should look like in these the Reagan years. And
Mm-hmm.
so I see activists really just being very clever and strategic. They're working within their context to accomplish amazing things. I think they sometimes get not as much attention because they're just very skilled in the system,
Oh,
advocates in many
mm,
cases,
interesting.
but they do amazing things.
Can you give us a little taste of what the push of what motherhood was supposed to look like in the 80s, and yeah, what
Mhm.
was the narrative there?
Yeah, so of course, and I talk about this in different decades, but the 80s is really especially the moment of the quote unquote super mom or
Mm,
super mother.
mm,
And so you have a moment where owing from a mix of 1970s activism and then also 1970s economic conditions,
mm,
you have just a large number of white middle class women who, especially white middle class mothers who hadn't been in the paid workforce, entering the workforce.
mm,
Of
mm.
course, women have always worked.
Right. Mm,
And of course, uh, low income, working class women, et cetera, have always worked. But the visibility of the working mother totally changes in the 80s.
mhm,
And as this is more visible, a lot of the response is there's some pushback that this is just completely inappropriate. There's a lot of talk about family values at this time. Um, and at the same time, the sort of what has become of mainstream feminism by the 80s is saying, like, well, you can just have it all,
mm,
right? That's what advertisers are
mhm,
also
mhm,
saying. There's
mhm,
a weird confluence of things. You can have it all. You can do it
mhm,
all,
mhm, mhm.
right? You can be an amazing career woman. And if you imagine the shoulder pads and like you can do that and be an amazing mother.
Yeah. Yeah.
And at the same time, many of the expectations for motherhood are going up.
Mhm,
So I write for there's an important book that comes out in 1985 by Carol Dix. It's one of the first sort of books in the US aimed at lay women about postpartum depression.
mhm,
It's called The New Mother Syndrome.
mm,
And in the back of this book, there are ads for other books mothers would want.
mm.
And the ads are things like how to teach your baby math
What?
and, you know, how to buy the safest products for your baby.
Ah.
You're just like, of course, like it explains. I mean, there's a lot going on. Dix writes tons about hormones and other factors, but also like it explains a lot of things too, right? There's
Mhm,
huge pressures. At the same time, there's all these economic pressures and so on. So this is all going on. And so I think working within that context helps us understand how monumental what depression after delivery was doing was, what PSI was doing was, and also what a lot of the rising therapists, so
mhm,
psychologists and some clinical social workers were doing.
mhm.
So I also write about a number of women who become essentially postpartum professionals in the
Right.
80s.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Oh, that is an amazing perspective, and it is striking to me how much of that narrative and push, whatever, to have it all is still here. I mean, there's some pushback there now, finally, but well, I shouldn't say finally. In some, for some years, it's been there, but it is. I mean, just with the moms that I meet with individually for therapy, it's almost just it's in the water. It's
Mhm.
just embedded in them to have this. Got to find the safest product and do all the things and be the best mom, and the compare, and now with social media and all that, all of the comparisons that are happening, it hasn't, it just has like a hold on people.
It's really hard and it clearly affects folks very deeply, especially with all of these other compounding factors. And
Yeah.
it's so complicated, of course. But it's also interesting you mentioned social media because it's this moment, starting when I'm writing in the 2000s,
Mm,
I write about the 2010s.
mm,
And in that moment, you have to write about the internet, of course,
yeah.
because it simultaneously makes some things harder, but it also just allowed these mommy blogs, which
Mm-hmm.
people like mock, but are hugely important in the world
Yeah.
of postpartum wellness and
Right.
mental health. It allowed all of these women to simultaneously get their stories out and to connect
Mm-hmm.
in really critical ways. And
Mm-hmm.
so I find that a really fascinating development.
I'm sure, and there's I mean, so many factors that are impacting this along the way.
Yeah.
I kind of want to go back for just a second to find out like around, you said, I think 1920s or something is when you're first we're seeing um,
Oh yeah.
research or people talking about postpartum depression. What's the span of time you're talking
Yeah.
about in your book?
Okay. So, I mean, in terms of the historical literature,
Hmm.
there's not enough historical literature about this
Right.
yet, but there's moments of things that are similar to
Hmm.
postpartum illness, puerperal psychosis you see in the 19th century. There's parallel conversations about what's going on there.
Hmm.
A certain kind of melancholia, which is like a
Hmm.
very severe depression in the 19th century, was tied to the postpartum or to lactation. So there's like a long history of some of this. But what's kind of interesting is there's a narrative where there had been some of these 19th century conversations about very severe postpartum mental illnesses. But then we see that that sort of falls away in the 19, really between 1900 and 1920. So that's interestingly a period where there's just so many changes in what psychiatry is doing.
Hmm.
And psychiatry is basically saying, like, there's not enough evidence that a woman's mania in the postpartum period is different than her mania any other time. So it's kind of like outdated. So it was very
Hmm.
not modern to say
Right.
things like that. So that disappears from the literature. And it comes back in the 40s and 50s, but with a psychoanalytic, like
Oh,
post-Freudian kind of
sure.
neo-Freudian. You can start to imagine some of the language there.
Hmm.
Um, so, I mean, it's always there in different ways in the literature. My book gives a little bit of that long history,
Hmm.
but does focus heavily on the 1940s and beyond.
Having the perspective that you have on the history, maybe this is too big of a question, but like, how far have we come? Are there things that are still like, whoo, we really haven't come that far on, a couple of areas? I know for sure we've come far in a lot of ways, but what's that kind of long view into the past?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the long view, I do think that there's pretty extraordinary changes in how far we've come. Um, but one question I suppose it opens up is a question about what the end goal is,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So I think this is a hard question. It's an easier question for me to ask as a historian.
Uh-huh.
It's a much harder question for a lot of the advocates I talk to
For sure.
because understandably, advocates are worried about like, how are we going to get this one thing through the state house today? How are we
Hmm.
going to help this one woman in front of me today?
Hmm.
Um, but there is, I think, a big picture question of is the goal a world where no one gets perinatal mental illness? Is it a world where there's good treatment for it? Is our imagination that treatment would ideally be um, primarily psychopharmaceuticals? Would it be primarily social supports? And some of those big questions, and where the answer is often like a lot of things,
Hmm. Hmm.
I think can be hard to think through because there's just been certain paths taken. Um, and so and so I think that becomes a question, like what exactly there's been a lot of work toward medicalization, which I think has a lot of legitimizing power, right? There's a chapter or so in the book about the DSM
Hmm.
and the fight to get official recognition for postpartum mental illness in the DSM.
Right.
And folks have, I'm sure you know this story or pieces of it, but it fought very hard for proper recognition.
Hmm.
And it's ended in this very unsatisfying, the onset modifier, the
Hmm.
very limited onset modifier, right? But
Yeah.
even that was just so much energy
Right.
that folks put in to make that happen. And so that's, I think, one way in which we have not come very far,
Right.
right?
Right.
But then it also raises these big questions about what are the spaces we need that for, right? And the
Mm.
spaces we need that for are our legal protection,
Yeah.
our insurance, our like there's very clear reasons that we need better diagnostics,
Right.
but it does force folks to ask to fight for these particular things. Um, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Thank you for that perspective. Because right, I do, and you do know a little bit about the fight to get this, all diagnoses in the perinatal period recognized
mhm.
in the DSM, and it does get really hard. Um, I don't even know the right word for it, but like as a clinician, as a psychologist, even, but when if I need to have a diagnosis for an insurance company, I have to, there isn't one. Sometimes I have to use like the next best available, which I mean it's fine. It doesn't need to be exactly fit. And we know some of the categories are problematic in any way. It does pose a problem, and I don't know all of the factors that are at play that is making this particular thing so hard to like bring into the future, if you will. But it's a huge issue. So I like the that you're able. It sounds like able to see in the book the places where we still have a long way to go, and where knowing this history is important for us. And can you speak to that? Like, just how is it and why is it important for us to know all of this, and how can it help us?
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that really came up a lot and just is on my mind a lot right now is what it means to think about postpartum mental illness and postpartum possibilities when you're working within a climate with some um, somewhat conservative ideas about what women's health might look like or what motherhood should look like.
Mm-hmm.
And you see folks with honestly very different political opinions working together in the 1980s, which is not an easy thing in
Mm-hmm.
advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
Folks who have very different political opinions and very different ideas, even about ideal motherhood, but are able to come together with the idea that, you know, women should not be in serious distress, like
Mm-hmm.
very basic places they can agree on.
Mm-hmm.
And that leads to certain paths to more of an emphasis on medical choices and so on. But it's, also very powerful to figure out those places where they're able to work together. So I really see that in parts of the 80s, parts of the 90s, and you see it today with folks doing postpartum advocacy who I've talked to who are very explicit that they want bills that they can get bipartisan support for,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is not easy and requires all kinds of complicated compromises,
Mm-hmm.
but also is extraordinarily strategic. Um, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a way people get things done. And so I do think there's this story that always pops out for me in this history, which is a story of um, men and women getting things done about postpartum distress,
Mm-hmm.
even when circumstances are hard.
Right. And we are in such a time now. And I don't know if it was harder then or harder now, or just hard in different ways in both times. But I know that a lot of people are concerned and worried that in particular women's health, perinatal mental health, and all kinds of other factors are um, in some ways going to be like cut out of the picture, or that things are not going to progress, or there'll be some kind of stalemate for a little while. And I don't know if we have the answers to that.
I don't. I don't. I think the framing by, very clever advocates over the years has been that we do not want mothers in distress. And I think that that's a very important message. Sometimes folks will also frame it about like babies and families, which,
Mhm.
you know, is both true, but also it worries me when we don't put the parents at the center or the birthing parent at the center.
Right.
But it's all an important picture. I think maybe folks will have to be very careful with this incredible strides around issues of race and culture that have
Mhm.
happened
Mhm.
because of advocacy in PSI in the last 5 or so years.
Mhm.
And I think that, you know, those are things to um, make sure folks are working, keeping in mind.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you said something about strategy and again, I don't have any real information or knowledge on this, but it I think what either you're saying or maybe I'm thinking is that the mm, the push in advocacy can be the same, but the words might need to be different. So that things can still be worked on without them being these like hot button words that will immediately be rejected.
Yeah. And I mean, strategy has taken different forms. And honestly, I am much better at talking about the my decades of study, so I should be focus on that. But I will say that strategy comes up, say, in the 80s, one way that advocates were getting a lot more attention to postpartum illness were these talk show appearances. So
Yes.
they were appearing on Donahue, they were on Oprah, they were
Mm-hmm.
on, Sally, Jesse, Raphael, like they were
Mm-hmm.
on all these shows,
Mm-hmm.
and those are incredibly imperfect venues.
Mm-hmm.
There's letters I read between folks where they're basically like, the show will only take us if they can put an infanticide story on or a psychosis story on, right?
Mm-hmm.
They want
Right.
these very sensational things that have incredible importance to tell those stories too, but create all kinds of complexity in how
Right.
stories are told.
Yeah.
And for the most part, advocates are like, we will just work within this.
Mm-hmm.
The attention is worth
Yes.
it.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's an important strategy.
No, you're absolutely right. And unfortunately, that what you were saying about those talks, that still happens. I mean, I've been approached for a, several shows that only want to talk about um, these like stories that are in the news and sensationalized and inaccurate in a lot of ways because whatever ratings and whatnot. But you're right to say that okay, this is what we've got. These are the platforms that we got. How can we use them? And it's good to see that history shows that there is benefit there.
Yeah. I mean, I think in that pre-internet time, one thing that folks told me about was like, how do you even get more information? Somebody appears on Oprah
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and they flash like sometimes they don't do anything. Sometimes they flash like a number.
Right, right.
One woman who was a psychiatrist associated with a hospital talked about like all of these people were able to like use the yellow pages to look up the
Yes.
hospital and they would
Yeah.
call the hospital switchboard. And
Wow.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's just so wild to think about some of the opportunities we have now
Yes.
um, to connect, but then also, um, yeah, how important those shows were to people.
Mm-hmm. And curious how's your work being received? What are people's responses to this history and to your book?
Yeah. It's it's really been pretty overwhelmingly positive. I think there's a pretty broad understanding that this is a needed history
Yeah, for
and
sure.
that we need to know more about women's lives, women's health in many different ways, but in particular the story of postpartum mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
I think the only pushback I've gotten has been very gentle, but it's been about like, oh, you didn't include this story,
Oh,
or oh, like
mm-hmm.
there's not enough on psychosis, which
Mm-hmm.
does come up a lot, but it's not the thread.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and to me, it's just so much evidence. We just need more books. We need more
Mm-hmm.
or more podcasts, more
Mm-hmm.
memoirs, more
Mm-hmm.
storytelling. Um, and I hope that's on the horizon.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's been this groundswell. And maybe that bears out in what you've seen too, and what is available of a history of stories and whatnot that there is progress forward, and people are definitely more open. I'm just even here on this podcast, people coming on to tell their stories, and other podcasts as well. I agree with you. More books, more podcasts, more people talking about, like, everybody just like, let's do this. It would be great. So with all, I mean, all of the work that you've done here is so incredibly important. And um, I think that this isn't one of those books where you just like read it and cool, put it back on the shelf. I mean, it sounds like there's so much in there that we can learn from and build on, and also potentially usable stuff for moms, families, clinicians. How do you envision, how would you hope maybe that people use this book?
Right. So I really think of the value of it coming in a few ways, but I
Mm-hmm.
think just as a historian, I am a big proponent of historicizing everything, right? By which I mean basically everything has a history, and understanding how that screener got in front of you,
Mm-hmm.
how that legislation exists, how insurance covers mental health in a way it didn't
Mm-hmm.
in the past. Like how these
Yeah.
things happened,
Right.
how PSI is as big as it is. Like understanding all of these things,
Mm-hmm.
I think gives us lots of insight into both making sense of them, right?
Right.
Because the historical lens lets you know, okay, I understand this better now that I understand how it got there. I understand
Yeah.
what's valuable about it because I understand its path.
Absolutely.
And so that's wonderful. But then I also think there's pieces of lessons for the
Mm-hmm.
future. So
Mm-hmm.
I think I never believe like you should just, you're not going to do exactly what people did historically, of course, even when
Mm-hmm.
there are parallels. But I think there are lessons about how folks negotiated, about how folks tried to envision creative paths forward, about
Mm-hmm.
how folks had conversations that they're still having, right?
Yeah.
Conversations about media, conversations about um, diagnosis, conversations about all these things that are ongoing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what did that conversation look like in the
Mm-hmm.
70s, the 80s, the 90s? It helps inform having that today. So I
Absolutely.
do hope people feel that.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I just, it feels really important, your book. Um, really, really important for us in the field too. Um, for me personally, it's very motivating to hear and see that history there, and kind of rekindling some of that, like, okay, well, yes, there is a history here, there is a momentum, there are things we can learn from and improve upon, and there's still so far to go. That's maybe always there. But I find this super helpful and enlightening and encouraging and inspiring, and I'm really grateful that you wrote the book and that you've come on here to talk about it.
Thank you. I appreciate that so much. I should add one more thing, which is
Yeah.
that um, it comes out in an audiobook next month, which I assume is exciting for podcast listeners. I love audiobooks, so I'm
Yes.
very excited too.
Yes. That is how I consume books.
Yeah, February 2025.
Perfect. That's perfect timing. I'm really glad to hear that. Well, again, thank you so much for being here. And I'm definitely going to point everybody in your direction so that they can go find out about your work and get this awesome book.
Thank you so much. Lovely conversation.
So if you'd
Thanks.
like to get connected with Rachel, and please do go to rachellouisemoran.com. You can also find her on LinkedIn and Blue Sky Social. And the book is available in audiobook as of February 18th. So if you're like me and you consume books by listening to them, that is a great option for you. Sometimes, honestly, I have both. I like the hard copy and the audiobook at the same time. In any case, please go grab this book and learn about the history of postpartum depression in America. And if you haven't yet, please follow, subscribe, all of that good stuff wherever you listen to this podcast, whether it be on Apple Podcasts, whether it's on Spotify, and now on Audible, and also over on YouTube. please come join me so you can get all of the episodes downloaded directly to you when they first become available. Definitely keep sharing this podcast. I know that your help with sharing this has helped so many people. Thank you for joining me. Until next time.